Welcome to USVibe. We're talking about a country just 90 miles from Florida, yet politically, strategically, and emotionally, it feels worlds apart. Cuba, an island frozen in time for some, a geopolitical pressure point for others, and right now, a name quietly climbing U.S. search trends as tensions rise once again. This is not just a story about a Caribbean nation. This is a story about power, oil, history, and a rivalry that refuses to die. Cuba sits at the crossroads of the Americas, geographically small, but historically explosive. From Spanish colonization to Cold War flashpoints, this island has repeatedly punched far above its weight. And in 2026, Cuba is back in the headlines for reasons that could reshape regional stability. Let's start with the basics. Cuba is the largest island in the Caribbean, home to over 11 million people. Its culture is rich, its history complex, and its political system, communist since 1959, remains one of the most controversial in the Western Hemisphere. For decades, Cuba has lived under the shadow of U.S. sanctions, embargoes, and diplomatic hostility. But history doesn't stay buried. In recent weeks, reports from major international news outlets have highlighted a growing crisis surrounding Cuba's energy supply, specifically oil. Cuba's economy is under immense pressure. Aging infrastructure, chronic shortages, and limited domestic energy production have pushed the country into a dangerous dependency on foreign oil imports. And this is where things get serious. According to multiple reports, the United States is now signaling a hardline stance against countries that supply oil to Cuba. The language coming out of Washington is sharp. Tariffs, economic retaliation, national emergency rhetoric. Words that carry weight, not just for Havana, but for any nation doing business with it. Why oil? Because oil is not just fuel. Oil is survival. Without steady oil shipments, Cuba's power grid falters. Transportation slows. Hospitals struggle. Factories shut down. Daily life grinds to a halt. And when an entire nation's basic functions are threatened, instability follows. U.S. officials argue that oil revenues help sustain a communist government they view as repressive and hostile to American interests. Critics, however, warn that squeezing Cuba's energy lifeline risks humanitarian fallout, ordinary citizens paying the price for geopolitical chess. This tension is not new, but the stakes feel different now. During the Cold War, Cuba was a frontline state, the site of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the closest the world has ever come to nuclear war. While missiles are no longer pointed at Florida, the strategic anxiety remains. Any escalation in Cuba ripples outward, affecting Latin America, U.S. border politics, migration flows, and global energy markets. And migration is already part of this story. Economic hardship in Cuba has driven waves of migrants toward the United States in recent years. Every blackout, every fuel shortage, every food line increases the pressure. For U.S. policymakers, Cuba is not just a foreign issue, it's a domestic one. Now layer politics on top. Strong rhetoric against Cuba plays well with certain U.S. voter bases, particularly Cuban-American communities with deep historical grievances against the Havana government. Tough policies are often framed as moral stands, against communism, against authoritarianism, against perceived threats close to home. But internationally, the picture is more complicated. Several countries maintain trade relationships with Cuba, including energy cooperation. If the U.S. moves to penalize these nations, it risks diplomatic friction far beyond the Caribbean. What begins as a Cuba policy could quickly become a broader trade conflict. And that's where the word danger enters the conversation. Not danger in the sense of immediate war, but danger through escalation. Sanctions lead to countermeasures. Countermeasures harden positions. Dialogue disappears. Miscalculations multiply. History shows us how quickly that can spiral. Inside Cuba, the situation is tense. The government frames external pressure as economic warfare. State media emphasizes sovereignty and resistance. Meanwhile, everyday Cubans are caught in the middle, navigating shortages, inflation, and uncertainty about the future. This is the human side often lost in political debates. A teacher waiting hours for public transport. A doctor working through power outages. A family cooking with limited fuel, wondering how long supplies will last. For Americans watching from afar, Cuba can feel abstract, a headline, a policy argument, a relic of Cold War history. But for millions on the island, this moment is deeply personal. So where does this go? That's the question driving U.S. search trends right now. Will Washington push harder, using economic pressure to force political change? Will supplier nations back away, fearing U.S. retaliation? Or will this standoff harden Cuba's isolation even further? There are no easy answers. What's clear is that Cuba still matters, strategically, politically, and symbolically. It remains a mirror reflecting America's long struggle with ideology, influence, and control in its own hemisphere. And as oil tankers, tariffs, and diplomatic warnings dominate the conversation, one truth stands out. This is not just about Cuba. It's about power in the Americas. It's about how far pressure can go before it breaks something or someone. 90 miles. That's all that separates the United States from Cuba. Yet in those 90 miles lies decades of mistrust, confrontation, and unresolved history. And right now, that history is stirring again. Stay alert, because what happens next in Cuba won't stay in Cuba. This is USVibe.